Psalm 139 will be the first place we look at all. I often have lessons that are a long time in the queue, and I don't really pay attention to where they fall. And this has been in my queue of lessons now for a month, and I didn't realize until today, or I think yesterday, that it was going to fall on Memorial Day weekend. There were some very famous words that were penned in the spring of 1776 that have spoken into reality the mentality that has pervaded all these years later and has been entering into our collective mind, defining us as a people. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And our simple task for this morning is to look at those three elements, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and ask if they are truly unalienable rights. These are the opening words for the Declaration of Independence, giving them the means and the rights in their own mind to hold these things true, or hold these things to themselves at any cost, to fight anything that needs to be fought in order to obtain and to maintain these things. And as Americans, this has been a part of our mentality for all of these decades later. And I want to just examine those for a few moments. And so the first one, as we look at of life, here in Psalm 139 and verse 12, it is undoubtable that life comes from God. He says there in verse 12, "For even the darkness is not dark to you, the night is as bright as day. For the darkness is as light with you. For you have formed my inward parts, and you have knitted me together in my mother's womb." We understand that God makes us who we are, that He has created life, and He creates life for each one of us individually. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, as Moses is ending his speeches to the nation of Israel as they're about to enter the land, he urges them here in verse 19. He says, "I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death and blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, and you and your offsprings may live, loving the Lord your God and obeying His voice and holding fast to Him, for He is your life and your length of days." And as we know in Paul's famous speech in Acts chapter 17, as he's there in the Areopagus, and he is surrounded by all of these idols, he speaks to them about the unknown God, the idol that they have to the unknown God. And he mentions there in verse 27 and verse 28 that in this God, that they should seek God and perhaps find their way towards Him, or seek their way, or feel their way towards Him and find Him, and yet He's not actually far from each one of us. For in Him we live and we move and we have our being. For in some of your own poets have said, "Indeed we are His offspring." All the things that we have in our life is due to God. There are things that we can do to end it faster, but you cannot create your heartbeat. That is something that God gives to you. And hold your breath as long as you want to, but within a couple minutes you're going to be choosing to breathe again. Your breath is something that is involuntary, that God gives to you. That your life is indeed a gift from God, but the question comes up, is it unalienable? Do we find individuals in the Bible who hold their life so precious that anything and everything is worth saving it? I don't find that. Jesus died at the age of about 33 at the hand of others. I'm less than 2 weeks away from turning 33, and that's a really sober moment. I feel really young. Sometimes my back goes out and I got a wonky knee, and sometimes all other bits and pieces hurt, but I feel young. I don't feel that 33 is nearly long enough to live, and yet He freely gave His life up at 33. He didn't feel that His life was worth so much that He could not allow someone else to take it. John the Baptist, his cousin, lived even less time and died at the hands of Herod in prison. Consider all the prophets in the Old Testament who were killed by their own people and yet did not fight back against them. Stephen was martyred in Acts chapter 7. James the Apostle is killed a couple of chapters later in chapter 12. beheaded with a sword. And then, according to secular history, all the other prophets, or all the other apostles, except for John, died an early death for their faith. In Luke chapter 12, turn with me to Luke chapter 12 for a moment. Jesus, in preparing his apostles for their eventual life, or the end of their life. Luke chapter 12, there in verse 4 down to verse 7, Jesus says, I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, and after that have nothing more that they can do to you. But I warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he is killed, has the authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. For are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies, and not one of them is forgotten before God? Why, even the hairs of your head are numbered. Fear not. You are more valuable than many sparrows. The conclusion I'd like to make from this very short point is that life is a gift from God, and it is precious, absolutely precious. But our life is not the most important thing in our lives. In Romans chapter 14, Paul phrases it this way, as we're looking at all the controversial things of Romans 14, all the things that individuals can argue and fight over. There in verse 8 of Romans 14, Paul phrases this, to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be both Lord. Oh, sorry, verse 8, that was verse 9. My eyes are a bit wonky as well now that I'm nice, ripe age of 32. He says, for in him we live, for if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. Paul is not advocating that our life is an unalienable right, that you should fight to the very end to hold fast to. That is the most important thing in your life is your life. In fact, he gives you the complete opposite. If you live to the Lord. If you die, make sure you die to the Lord. So whether you live or whether you die, the most important thing is that you are the Lord's. Jesus telling his disciples, knowing that all of them except for John are going to meet an earthly end at the hand of somebody else, he says, do not fear those who kill the body, and then have nothing more to do to you. But fear him who after killing has the authority to cast you to hell. The most important thing that Jesus says is not your life, but what you do with your life. The next thing that Thomas Jefferson wrote is of the unalienable rights is life, and then liberty. And that liberty is not something that is always granted. Consider of all the people who were imprisoned for the gospel. Paul, who could have lived a life of luxury, who could have lived in Jerusalem up to 80, 70, fairly happily, decided to live a hard life. He was imprisoned several times, not only in Jerusalem and then in Rome, and released and re-imprisoned in Rome, but also in Asia Minor. Liberty was not something that to him was an unalienable right that he wasn't willing to give up. John spent the rest of his life, as we know, on the island of Patmos, not having the authority to get up and put his own clothes on the way that he would want to. Peter was imprisoned as well. When his fellow companion James was beheaded with a sword, he expected fully to die in prison, where he was imprisoned. As we turn over the book of Philemon, Philemon is another hard book, in the sense that Philemon is a runaway slave who, I won't say chance encounter, because it certainly wasn't a chance encounter, interacts with Paul and becomes a Christian. And Philemon has to carry his own letter back to Onesimus, his owner, and the letter does not contain the words, set him free. It says, accept him as a brother. It's a strange way of looking at it in our modern American times, but his letter didn't contain his freedom. In fact, Paul told Philemon that he had to go back and to live as a faithful servant to Onesimus. It's a hard thing. He was not automatically granted inalienable rights in that sense. There are many passages, Titus chapter 2 and Ephesians chapter 6 and 1 Peter chapter 2, all give extensive lists on how slaves were to live as Christians. There is one passage over in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that deals with the slave getting out of slavery. And the way that he phrases it in verse 17 is like each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, to which the Lord has called him. And this is my rule in all the churches. And then in verse 20, he says, each one of you should remain in the condition to which you were called. Were you a bondservant or a slave when you were called? Do not be concerned about this. But if you gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. That's the most that is ever said about it. The Bible never advocates slavery. And following the biblical principles of loving others and showing honor and respect for your fellow brother is what effectively ended slavery in Europe, kind of peacefully and overnight. But the Bible does not make liberty an unalienable right that God has granted everybody at all times. That is the most important thing that you have to fight for and defend to the very end. It's not how the Bible phrases it. Paul freely gave up his liberty in order to serve the gospel, along with Peter. We know that Titus also had the same thing happen to him, historically speaking. In fact, most of the people you read in the Bible don't have complete liberty in their life because they chose something other than liberty as being more important. And the last thing, whether you follow John Locke, is the property, but if you go with Thomas Jefferson, it's pursuit of happiness. Happiness is used twice in the Bible. The word that's used in Hebrew is used in a variety of other ways. It means good or wealth, but it's used in the sense of happiness twice. The first one is in Isaiah chapter 52 and verse 7. And if you want to turn there, we can just read that really quick. And as you read through it in the Old Testament, it's going to sound familiar because it's quoted in the New Testament. But Isaiah 52, there in verse 7, he says, "How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, and who brings the news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns." And if it sounds familiar because it's quoted in Romans chapter 10 and verse 15, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel of peace, who proclaim the good news. So the happiness that Isaiah is referring to is not the happiness of a temporary, I'm enjoying this. It's the happiness that is brought about by the gospel. The second time that the word happiness is used is in the book of Lamentations chapter 3. And if you think Lamentations doesn't sound like a happy book, you're right. Because in verse 17, Jeremiah says that happiness, I have forgotten happiness. I've forgotten how to be happy, is how he phrases it there in Lamentations chapter 3 and verse 17. Joy and rejoicing are used much more in the Bible. But joy and rejoicing are a deeper and richer state of mind than temporary happiness. What we are told is in 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1, Peter tells us there in verse 14, "As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance." That's somebody's passion. That's something that you're driven to. You do it because it gives you temporary joy or temporary happiness. And he tells you, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, be holy in all of your conduct. Paul mentioned several times, especially over in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, that he spent a lot of unhappy nights. Unhappy nights thinking and kind of being consumed with thoughts of the various congregations that he had helped with, individuals. Happy nights where he were hungry or shipwrecked or adrift in the sea or he was imprisoned. A lot of times that weren't overly filled with joy or filled with happiness. But he tells them in Philippians, when he's in prison, that he has found the secret of contentment. Not of happiness, but of contentment. To face money and hunger, abundance and in need, through Jesus Christ, who was crucified. We are not called to pursue happiness at all costs, and yet that is often an oft-touted phrase, that God just wants me to be happy. How many times have you heard that whenever you talk to people about God? Well, God just wants me to be happy, and yet you cannot find that in the Scriptures, where God says, I just really want you to be happy. A lot of times he encourages and demands that people give up what gives them temporary happiness because it's sinful, so that they can obtain holiness. And yet, in our collective mindset as Americans, sometimes we view the things that were written by Thomas Jefferson, the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as being the end-all, be-all of life, what God has intended for us, and that we have to defend it at all costs. And yet, that is not in the Scriptures. Individuals who have given up their lives freely for something that is more important than even their life. Who have given up their liberties in order to live a godly life. And they have given up their temporary happinesses to obtain holiness and joy that comes through that. The main point, Matthew chapter 6, is that you may be at some point in time called to give up your life or your liberty or your happiness in order to follow God. That is a real possibility in our lives. And this is the conclusion that he gives here in Matthew chapter 6, there in verse 33. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And all these things, all the bodily needs, all the home, the food, that will be added to you. But seek first God's kingdom. The individuals of great faith in the Bible, the individuals we revere, we looked up for good reasons, are individuals who did not perceive life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as being unalienable rights that must be defended at all costs. They were things that were given by God, but could be freely given up in order to serve him. Our lives as Christians is not calling us to be Americans, it's calling us to be Christians, followers of God. And sometimes it means we're going to have to lose our lives. Sometimes it means we might have to give up our freedom. I've heard a lot of talk of what might happen in the next few years if religious talk over homosexuality or abortion or gay rights might become taboo and even become hate speech or crimes. In the near future, giving up liberty may be exactly what we have to do. And Jesus tells us to seek first, above all else, God's kingdom and his righteousness. Allow tomorrow's worries to be tomorrow. To focus on what we need to do today. So our challenge for this week is to recognize that God has given us many blessings, but there is no blessing that is more important than seeking God's kingdom and his righteousness, including our own life or our own liberty or our own happiness. It's a hard challenge. But it's a challenge I think is every bit worthwhile. The song that's been picked out for us, Wayne's pick number 809. The only way that we can gain our lives in Christ is to give up who we used to be. To give up our sense of identity in this world in order to gain his identity. To give up all of our life and our liberty and our sinful natures in order to find a holiness in God. If we can help you to do that this morning, let us know as we stand and sing number 808.